with the scientific arguments that are being presented against the Bible. I know as I grew up, I didn't grow up in the Christian church, and so I'd only been presented one history, so to speak, of where we came from. Question number one: how did we get here? So I'd only ever been shown one option for that, and of course I'd been taught the scientific things you were mentioning, and it does seem to be affecting people and the way they think, and this generation especially. I know working in youth ministry, George Barna came out with a statistic in 2000, and I don't know if you know who George Barna is, but he's kind of like the Christian Gallup
poll taker. Yeah, he does surveys of within the church and so on.
And he seems to be pretty accurate. You can actually look at the way he structures the questions and stuff like that. But he came up with a quote that said, when asked to estimate the likelihood that they will continue to participate in church life once they're living on their own, these are kids from Christian homes that went to public school. And the majority of kids from Christian homes go to public school. The response was levels dip precipitously to only about 1 out of every 3 teens. What he was saying is that 70% of those kids say that when they reach age 18, they're going to walk away from the faith, and it's just not relevant to them anymore.
We've heard statistics from Barna, from folks like Josh McDowell, and other people who take surveys and so on. There are huge percentages of children who've grown up in the church. When they get to post-secondary education, they will leave Christianity because the world's astronomy and biology and geology and so on, they seem to have answers. And they seem to make sense from a certain viewpoint. And we'll look at that.
And let's face it, we all want to be consistent people. You can't, it's very hard to hold two diametrically opposed viewpoints in the same skull at the same time. And those are real things that we're seeing.
You want to have reasons for what you believe, right? Whether you believe in millions of years, you want to have reasons, something that supports that. You don't just want to have blind faith in millions of years.
That's right. And this is just a stat, and people can look at that and say, well, it's just a statistic. But getting to travel around now to different churches, and I meet with different pastors and youth pastors. A couple of years ago, I sat down with he was the youth overseer for a major Christian denomination in Canada, and I told him about this statistic, and I explained to him, well, I'm talking to many
60 to 70%.
Yeah, I told him, I'm seeing this stat, I'm talking to many pastors, many youth pastors, and people are saying, yeah, this seems to be holding out. You're a leader of leaders in this denomination. What do you see? And he said, Cal, in our denomination, it's about 80%.
80%.
Now,
that's amazing.
I point out to people, if you had a wound and you were losing 70% of your blood, you probably want to do something about it fast.
So there's a problem here. What's the solution? Stay tuned for the answers.
And we've been talking about how people seem to be accepting these notions of that some scientists are presenting with a different history of the universe, of how we got here. Question number one. And I always like to point out to people that really this isn't a question of science versus faith. This is more of a faith versus faith issue.
It really is.
Yeah. Because we're talking about something that happened in the past. No one was there except for God, in my opinion, and so because of that, we're making guesses about what happened in the past. But there's a couple of quotes I like to use when I'm speaking, just to remind people of this. This was George Wald, and he was a Nobel Prize winner for medicine in 1967.
And an evolutionist, right?
An evolutionist. And he wrote a book, Frontiers of Modern Biology, on the theories of the origin of life. So he's talking about the theories of the origin of life.
Okay.
But he makes this very honest statement, and he says, I don't want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generation leading to evolution.
Well, that's an interesting admission, isn't it?
It certainly is, and he's writing this book on biology, but he must recognize the fact there's only two solutions to question number one: either God created or we evolved. He's rejecting. He just says, I don't want to believe in God, probably because of the moral implications of if God created, he's probably got some rules, and perhaps you should follow them.
Well, it's interesting also that he points out the evolutionary impossibility of spontaneous. He calls it spontaneous generation. Of course, that reminds us of Pasteur and the life begets life principle, of course, in biology.
Yeah, the fact is nobody's ever observed something spontaneously coming to life out of nowhere.
That's right.
We see life from life. But
we have stories about it, but no one's observed it.
That's right. Now, here's another quote that I like to use, and this is from Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins is he's a prolific writer. He's a very charismatic man. He's on tour right now in the States promoting his new book, The God Delusion, I understand. And so he's an evolutionist, and he just has a position that, if you believe in God, you're deluded. And he makes this statement in an interview in 1996 with Lanny Swerdlow. He said, "You cannot be both sane and well-educated and disbelieve in evolution." He says the evidence is so strong that any sane, educated person has got to believe in evolution.
So he's saying, what's he saying about us then?
Well,
I don't believe in evolution.
No,
I
guess,
think I'm educated.
I would say by that statement you're insane and
insane.
You're uneducated.
Yeah, I guess, according to Dawkins, right?
But it's interesting, I got this quote, and this was from World Magazine in 1997, so a year later, and Dr. Dawkins is he's at Washington University doing a speech, and he's explaining his intellectual commitment to Darwinian evolution as the explanation of human origins, and he made this statement 1 year later. He said, "We don't need evidence, we know it to be true."
Oh, okay. So now we've gone from, if you're well educated, you've got to be insane not to believe evolution, to we don't need evidence, we just believe it.
Right. Now, as a Christian, if as somebody asked me to defend my faith, like 1 Peter 3:15 says, and I said, well, I don't have a defense for my faith, I just believe it. I don't really need evidence. Typically you would get the response, well, you see, that's a blind faith, and you just believe it because maybe your mom and dad told it to you or something like that. But see the switch up here. The evidence is so important, but we don't need evidence because we know it to be true. We're going from a faith position to, is there really that much evidence for evolution?
One of the key things that we need to talk about is different types of science.
Right.
Right? And we've hinted at this already a little bit. There are different types of science. Mm-hmm. There's the good kind of science, experimental science or operational science, we refer to it that way.
Right.
And that's the kind of science that's done in a lab where scientists can go and you can repeat your observations over and over again.
Right. And that's how we get things like scientific theories. So if I believe, I get hit on the head with an apple, and then I think, well, maybe there's this force that somehow pulls objects towards, centers of large masses, and gravity, then I can take out a penny, and I could do it now, and we could repeat the experiment.
Or you could let yourself get hit by an apple many times and measure that, and then come up with an explanation for how that happens.
So I start with my hypothesis, and then I could actually bring that to the point of a scientific theory.
Right, and that kind of science leads to technological advancements like these television cameras and lights and computers and so on. It's good stuff.
Right.
As we do that kind of science on living things, we discover how we work, how our eyes work, or whatever. We can improve our standard of life.
Right.
That's one of the goals of science. Mm-hmm. Good stuff.
Yep.
It leads to those advancements in technology and also medical advancements. We can ease pain and suffering for folks who have medical conditions.
But there's another type of history of science, right? And you'll hear people make statements like, well, we've measured this amount of sedimentation here, therefore millions of years ago, and a lot of people don't catch that that concept that they just went from, okay, we're measuring something in the present, to therefore millions of years. They just jumped a boundary there. Maybe you can talk about that.
We kind of call that origin science or historical science, where you're looking at things that are happening in the present, like, as you mentioned, sedimentary deposits. A certain rate is accumulated over so many years or whatever. And then you have to make up, you observe that in the present, but then you look at, for example, the strata in Grand Canyon, and you're saying, well, what we observe today, that's always gone on, and so we make up a story, a history about Grand Canyon.
Right.
Fossils are a great example. We've got a fossil here. This is a piece of dinosaur bone. And if you'd go out and find this in the field, you'd have to... we could do experimental science on this, right? We could grind it up. We could do a chemical analysis on it, figure out what it's made out of, and so on. But to be honest, that's pretty boring. What we want to know about the fossil is, when did it live? When did it die? How fast did this animal run? What did it eat? What was its social interaction with those other animals over there? And then the fossil becomes interesting.
Right.
But that's an interpretation. We don't directly observe what the animal was eating. I mean, it's dead, right?
That's right.
All of the evidence scientists or anyone ever has exists in the present. This fossil exists now, in my hand, in the present. We never have the past, ever.
Right.
We make up stories about the past to explain the evidence which only exists in the present. A key point for people to understand.
Because I was out doing we were in the Badlands last year in Alberta, and we went out, and sure enough, we found bones in the rock. but they didn't come with little tags on them saying, "Oh, I'm 165 million years old."
Right.
The fact was there was a bull.